Crypto enforcement, the rule of law, and SDGs, the importance of a strong legal system. So we welcome Sanjeev, Bhasker, also Sarah Hammer, Amanda Wick, and Liz Boison to the stage. We're already here. And talk about the robust legal system and a discussion about that. So take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think I'll just start by giving the panelists a chance to say a little bit about themselves. So Sanjeev, can we go with you?
Thank you. Thank you first off to GBBC for having us. It's an honor to be here. It's great to hear our colleagues discuss and teach and learn, and great to be part of the discussion. My name is Sanjeev Bhasker. I serve as our United States Digital Currency Counsel in our Money Laundering and Asset Recovery section with the U.S. Department of Justice. That's a mouthful. It's a pleasure to be here. I will give you our standard disclaimer that I am speaking in my personal capacity, not officially on behalf of the Department of Justice. And again, great to share the stage with our colleagues.
It's great to be here today. I'm Sarah Hammer, and I want to thank Sandra Rowe and Liz and Hogan, Lovells, and the GBBC for hosting today. And it's great to be here with friends like Amanda, who I've known for a little while, and new friends like Sanjeev. And wonderful to see all of you. I'm especially excited to talk about this topic today. I lead financial technology initiatives at the Wharton School, and our corporate accelerator focused on financial technology, and was previously at U.S. Treasury, the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities, and was a trader and portfolio manager. So I'm excited about the topic today.
Hi, I'm Amanda Wick. I know Liz and Sanjeev because we all used to be federal prosecutors at the Department of Justice. I left there and went to FinCEN to be a policy advisor, went to Chainalysis where I was the chief of legal affairs, went back to the government to work on the Hill, and then founded the Association for Women in Cryptocurrency. And then I also am a principal with a consulting company called Insight Consulting.
Wonderful. And I'm so glad that everyone gave a little bit about their history, because based on their current titles, it may not be manifest to everyone why this group is pulled together to talk about crypto enforcement and the importance of a strong rule of law. So, shouldn't come as any surprise. Spoiler alert, the consensus of this group is probably going to be that strong regulation and rule of law are needed in order to pursue and achieve the SDGs. So without stealing anyone's thunder, thinking about what are the components of a strong legal system, because it's, it may just not be enforce all the time. Looking for things like predictability, fairness, understanding how different players are going to be treated in the ecosystem, international cooperation, good government, so that no one is caught off guard by, lack of fair notice or any surprises. I think those are some of the hallmarks that I think of, but I want to turn it over to our panelists to sort of get a sense of, what they think about when they hear the words, a strong legal system, because I know that we're pursuing that certainly in the US, but also uniformly globally in order to achieve the objectives. So Sarah, I wonder if we could start with you. What are the hallmarks that you think of with a strong legal system?
Sure. Thank you so much, Liz. And I want to thank Sandra again. I'm really excited about this topic and what GBBC is doing here this week in advance of the UN Summit next week, because when I think about rule of law, I harken back to my days at Oxford, where I had the privilege of studying international human rights law. And so taking kind of a big picture approach to what we're thinking about today, and then we'll all boil it down to what we're talking about with crypto and enforcement. I feel that rule of law is so essential to all of the topics that we will discuss this week and next week with regard to the SDGs and some of the challenges that we have faced in achieving those goals, things like the war in Ukraine, for example, or the pandemic and the economic devastation that's taken place as a result. Rule of law is one of the many important concepts that has been essential to the founding of the UN, and that's why we're all here this week and next week. And there were really three things that that were in consideration when we founded the UN. It was human rights law, development, and peace and security. And to have that, you need to have adherence to rule of law, you need equitable enforcement, transparency, collaboration, and certainty. And those are really just a few of the things that I think about when I think about rule of law. And then taking that into the SDGs, which we'll talk about in more detail today, and whether or not we've made progress towards some of those really important objectives. So I'm going to toss it to my fellow panelists from there, but those are just a few of the high level things that I think about.
Great. Amanda, any thoughts on that?
I think one of the interesting things is, having come from a law enforcement agency, I feel like all of us came from the perspective of course, you need rule of law. I think one of the reasons why what GBBC does that's so incredible is that with the invention of disintermediate finance, that was like the last piece that was missing from true globalization. When you think about the movement of data, when you think about the movement of people, what was missing was the ability to instantly move money. And so now you have this true globalization happening, which creates some issues, because now the question of some jurisdictions that previously didn't necessarily have rule of law, that maybe didn't matter, now matter a lot, because we see, especially in our past lives, things like jurisdictional arbitrage and things where if you don't have sufficient rule of law in a country, but now you are able to have massive amount of financial flows through it, and they're not observing FATF rules, or they're not playing ball, what is the solution? Because you can't have giant black holes of illicit finance when there's something like disintermediated finance, and attacking it country by country isn't a feasible solution if it's truly globalized, which is why entities like GBBC are so important, because if you just think that the US is going to solve this problem, the last 3 years proved you dead wrong, didn't it? So if you're looking at what other countries are doing and a discussion of rule of law globally and how are we going to handle this globally, I think we are now looking at the globalization of rule of law in a way that we never have, which I think is great.
Well, thank you. And Sanjeev, turning now to the American system and how the US government has approached this. We've heard things like a whole of government approach. Obviously, there are robust parts of the administrative state as well as law enforcement. Coming from the law enforcement side, can you explain what the digital currency initiative is at DOJ, what the National Crypto Enforcement Team is, and a little bit about your portfolio?
Yeah, I appreciate that. First off, we're making efforts. And we realize this is a team approach, working together, government, private sector, industry together. So one of the questions I often get asked is, Sanjeev, what's the Department of Justice doing? And fortunately, we've had great leadership at the head of our department, including our criminal division specifically, when it comes to establishing initiatives, task force teams to address cryptocurrency issues, educate the public regarding these matters, and make sure we have a sustainable digital asset economy. Our digital currency initiative, which is housed in the MLRs and our money laundering asset recovery section, has 4 prongs to our portfolio. One, we prosecute cases. We're federal prosecutors. As Amanda mentioned beforehand, I was an assistant U.S. attorney for almost a decade throughout the United States, and now most recently in Washington with the digital currency initiative. Myself and my colleague, Paul Hemeseth, we serve as counsels of the department regarding these matters, taking duty calls from the field, being able to be responsive, really to both victims and law enforcement alike when it comes to educating, discussing, and prosecuting cases. 2, we do a lot of training. And the reality is, often many of us have had and we're still having our aha moments when it comes to cryptocurrency. We didn't wake up one day and understand what Bitcoin was, or zero knowledge proofs, or liquid staking. And there's a reality we need to teach these fundamentals and make sure we can educate our colleagues across the board regarding these matters. So we're doing that. Also, we're doing a lot of policy work on the Hill and internationally with the FATF, with the MiCA. Amanda mentioned the reality of a need for uniform regulation to avoid judicial arbitrage. We recognize that, and that's something we're making efforts to do as well. And finally, one of the reasons that I'm here today is the importance, again, thank you to Sandra and GBBC, for private sector engagement, to engage with industry, to say, one, we're here to help, we're here to root out crime and to address illicit causes of instances of crime involving digital assets, but also to say, help us learn with you. We want to understand how the technology works. We want to make sure we can give good counsel when it comes to people consulting us with policy, things of the like. And that comes from speaking with you, the developers, those involved in the blockchain ecosystem. So prosecuting cases, training, policy work, and finally private sector engagement are all part of our portfolio. I also have colleagues of mine that work together as a team in our National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team. Liz is an alum, I should say, of our great task force, which is now housed in our computer crime intellectual property section. And this task force and this team exists to prosecute the most sophisticated cases and crimes involving digital assets. mixers, tumblers, the like. Through these two initiatives, the digital currency initiative, the NSET, we've been able to address writ large a huge portfolio of crime involving digital asset, but more importantly, to partner with others, train others, and make sure we are having good, consistent law in the United States. And again, thank you to our leadership for supporting it. Part of the reason we're here today.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sanjeev. So looking at the SDGs and, just glancing down the list at which ones could be really well served by a well-regulated blockchain or crypto economy. The ones that kind of jumped off for me are learning and education, gender equality, clean energy, industry and innovation, peace, justice, and strong institutions. We've talked a lot in our various panels today about the potential that blockchain technologies have for monitoring and recording data, keeping everyone true to the books on climate and carbon credit tracking. And there are a number of other areas where this, could be very effective if done in the context of a strong legal system. So I wonder, Sarah, if I could turn it over to you first, are there any of the SDGs or other goals of the UN more generally that you see as being well served, by strong legal systems where they exist?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. And I appreciate what you said about some of the SDGs that you mentioned as areas where we can make progress. And as we've all talked about here today, and we'll be talking about next week as well, unfortunately, a lot of progress remains to be made towards the SDGs. And I'll actually be here on Sunday for SDG Day at the start of next week. If other folks are here, I'd love to chat with you because cross collaboration is one of the key concepts that's been flagged by the UN and the Secretariat as essential to catching up, really. We have a lot of progress to make. So I appreciate what you said, Liz, especially about the economic related SDGs. I think SDG number 1, which is elimination of poverty, is a key goal, which we have not made progress towards. And I think we owe it to ourselves to be brutally honest about that. And everything from rule of law, which we've talked about earlier, and transparency and fair adjudication, to sustainable finance and some of the issues that Amanda mentioned. That's certainly one area where those concepts and the role of blockchain and financial inclusion is essential. And as we increasingly live in a technologized world, I think there's a couple of things I think about. So one is the important work that GBBC is doing towards moving us towards advancement of goals like elimination of poverty, economic development goals, and the other is the digital divide. And I think we need to be clear about what's happening with that as well, just access to broadband, access to cellular, connectivity. That, I think, harkens to another goal that you mentioned, Liz, which is gender equality. And I think that, again, financial inclusion, crypto, blockchain are essential financial infrastructures that we need to think about carefully and responsibly, because that's another goal which sadly we have a lot of progress to make on. And when I think of women's equality, I also think about children, for example, and the repercussions of that in terms of economic development. So those are just two areas. And I think the broader concept that we can apply really to all the SDGs is financial infrastructure, the role of blockchain, the potential role of blockchain across the board towards achieving many of these objectives, and then the importance of rule of law as we apply some of these concepts.
Great. And Amanda, for you, as you have been traveling around the world in your role with women in cryptocurrency or otherwise, are there any cross-cultural comparisons or regimes other than the United States that are, meeting the various SDG objectives or goals, either through good government or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, just to touch on something that Sarah said, obviously, like the gender equality one is super important to me. That I got militant when I left in U.S. government. You have to understand, for some reason, I think it was because it was uncharted territory back in 2013. Initially, when nobody knew what crypto was, and to Sanjeev's point, we were all going to YouTube University because that's all there was. And we were learning, somebody came in and said, do you know what a Bitcoin was? And that's how I learned about crypto money laundering. And back then, most of the people in the government, for some reason, a lot of the prosecutors, the analysts, the agents, we were all women. Like a lot of USG crypto was women. And then I went out into the private sector and saw how women in tech were treated and was like, oh, good Lord, we had no idea how great we had it when we were in Gov. And so I started the association just because crypto and blockchain is a really interesting space where you have a lot of people, and granted, coming from different backgrounds. And I'm going to put aside the whole cypherpunk, libertarian, anarchist originations of the movement. So I'm just going to carve that out in a little corner. But a lot of the folks who are in the space now are a lot of people who are from TradFi, who came from government, who are from other spaces, who recognize that our traditional financial system, if it wasn't broken, it sure needed a lot of fixing. And there was a lot of room for improvement, and there really wasn't any competition, and there was no need to improve. So frankly, if we were being honest, most of the banks weren't. Like, not from an unbanked, underbanked, poverty, not any of the things, frankly, SDGs that mattered, right? Because they didn't have to. And then when there was competition and there was disintermediated finance and they could theoretically get cut out of the equation, well, now all of a sudden improvement is necessary, and now there's competition. And so you have a community in crypto and blockchain that is building something different. And so convincing them to build better and to build in inclusion, I find a little bit easier, because these are people who are saying, if we're going to build a whole new neighborhood and we're going to build new houses, why don't we build it good from the ground up, as opposed to TradFi, which is a little harder, where you're trying to bolt on equality to something that was built hundreds of years ago, and equality and including women and people of color wasn't really the culture. And so trying to bolt that on after the fact is harder. So I think that there's a place here in the entire conversation of crypto blockchain where gender equality, racial equality, financial inclusion, and just inclusion in the discussion of a broader range of voices, I think the crypto blockchain community, at least in my experience, has been more amenable to. To your question about the international space, I left the US in, I think, October, with no intention of ever coming back. And my mom begged me to come back. And it was really hard, because I had just spent a year investigating everything that is broken and wrong with our country on many levels. And I was really depressed. And then I went to foreign countries and talked with folks about what they were doing in crypto and blockchain. And I bumped into Sandra quite a bit on the road. And I won't speak for her, but I imagine she was hearing some of the same things I was, which was like, this is an amazing opportunity, because now you have competition. Now you have the possibility for countries who are more nimble to advance in a way that they didn't before, when they were being strangled and held hostage by the US dollar. And nearly every country that I talked to could pinpoint the moment of US policy history where they wanted off the US dollar, whether it was the Iraq War, whether it was sanctions, whatever it was. You can ask most of them, what was the thing that made you loathe being tied to US policy? And all of them could point to something. Now, in the past, 30 small kids on a playground could not overtake a big, fat, lazy bully who had gotten out of shape. But as it turns out, 30 small kids who have one thing in common, which is a unified desire to get off the US dollar, can actually get a lot done. And the lack of focus on that, and the kind of like single-minded blindness that the US government is putting towards that, I think is terrifying for a lot of us. And so I think if I learned anything while I was outside of the country looking in, it was, how does everybody in the United States not see what's happening in the rest of the world? Or they're just and I mean in the US government, to be clear, not Sanjeev, because I love him, but above Sanjeev. But that's I think the most terrifying thing as an American, is the complete lack of any functional discussion about the real possibility of de-dollarization, the concept of BRICS, a bunch of countries that should not have anything in common, but have one thing in common. And the complete kind of lack of discussion around that is scary.
Great. Well, thank you. If you were at our international trade conference happening right now at the Hogan Lovells office in DC, we are doing a discussion of de-dollarization, and specifically the threat that the Chinese yuan and other currencies can play in dealing with BRIC countries. And, are they trying to become, for political or economic reasons, the de facto dollar? I think of what Amanda was referring to in the sort of, collapse of the United States that she was investigating.
Yes, sorry. I should make that clear. Apologies. That sounded really weird. I was an investigator on the January 6th committee. I was the lead financial investigator. And so it was a dark year. Investigating
a pretty clear coup attempt involving, factions within the United States that We're funded somehow, and involving a lot of elements. We think of having such a strong legal system in the United States that's obviously being tested. But you see prosecutors leading cases and, judges now handing down things like 22-year-long sentences for that kind of conduct. So, thankfully, those are reinforcements of our legal system in that way in particular. But when you look elsewhere across the US government, I think a lot of the industry in crypto and blockchain, sees it as obstructionist, slow, waffling, led by a few strong personalities who can't make up their mind. And I'm not sure that it has the hallmarks actually of a strong legal system or where we need to be headed. Now, a lot of that can be in the regulatory space, in terms of setting out clear rules and predictability, but we are currently, facing, looking at cases like exchanges being sued by the SEC for failing to register as an exchange when only months before its S1 was approved by the SEC. Of course, I'm referring to Coinbase, and the government saying, well, we can review your disclosure documents and then sue you a few months later for engaging in that very same conduct. And that's okay for the reasons that they're now making that case in front of SDNY. But so is that really fair notice? Is that a meaningful opportunity to engage? Are those the hallmarks that we want to have as one of the more developed legal systems? Or are there alternatives that can be getting us to the SDG and other goals that industry has a little bit sooner? I don't know, anyone have any thoughts on that? Sarah, can I turn it to you?
Would it be okay, Liz? I just want to touch on what Amanda said about it's like, it's first of all, I'm glad you're back.
Yeah. Me too.
And we're all glad that you're here today. And I personally am also glad that all the DOJ and former DOJ people are including me in the panel today. But I just want to touch on what Amanda said about the finance system. I think it goes to your question too, Liz, at a higher level with the dollar, because I think issues around financial infrastructure and microfinance and what not only blockchain, but other financial technologies can bring to the SDGs and to some of the issues that Amanda talked about, issues like transparency and provenance and security. Those are things that technology has the potential or is already advancing us towards. And I think that some of the other issues that relate to what Amanda mentioned, things like the US dollar and tackling the high cost of debt. And the reality is, one of the key issues and complications that relates to the SDGs and some of the economic goals that we've talked about today is the high cost of debt, high interest rates, where we are currently, things like, what were the repercussions of the pandemic, and then what can we do to shore up that system, reworking debt, reworking business models. That is an important high-level concept that we need to think about, and for which blockchain and other financial technologies must play an integral role. So I hope you don't mind it. Just wanted to add my 2 cents there, because I think it's one of the overarching issues that is important to all the SDGs. And I think that, again, going back to cross collaboration, which the UN has mentioned is really important in achieving progress towards the SDGs, I think that's something we need to have cross collaboration on.
Sanjeev, you want to add anything to Liz's question or?
No, but I do want to say I'm glad Amanda's back.
We're all glad you're
Not
back.
that he's biased. I will say to your question about, because I think it was about US government and like the different levels. And I will say, I think one of the, and I don't want to speak for anyone else who's ever been at DOJ or is currently at DOJ, but I think one of the things that was, and I don't know if the right word is frustrating, is that enforcement always comes after activity. Right? Regulation tries to prevent bad activity from happening. And there are areas in the United States where it was very frustrating, because most of us would say back in 2007 when Bitcoin was invented, but certainly as of 2007, I can't, 8, there we go. Certainly as of 2013, when FinCEN issued its first guidance, it was very clear what constituted a money service business. So there was a clarity in a certain area that enforcement in that area would have been very fair. But you've actually seen very little enforcement in the area that was the clearest. And what you've seen is enforcement in the area that was the least clear. And I think that's really problematic when you think about the rule of law and how innovation works. And also when people say like, oh, well, you know, we didn't have it for the internet. The internet was the invention of widgets. It was not financial services. Financial services is very different, and you need clarity. You need clarity when money is moving instantly globally for pennies on the dollar, and people want to build things that constitute financial services that have financial in the name, like decentralized finance, but they want to pretend that it doesn't have finance in it, or they want to pretend that it's not financial services. And so you have this like very weird thing where you need a system, a rule of law that is innovative, because you need just enough guardrails for financial services to be able to innovate. But you don't want so much that it squashes innovation. The problem is that requires an F-16, that requires a government that's nimble, that requires something like fit for purpose regulation. What it's really hard for is an aircraft carrier that rarely moves, that moves in response to crisis. We've had the BSA since 1970, and it really wasn't functional until 9/11, and we got the Patriot Act. And a lot of us are worried that it'll take a crisis event in crypto before the US government gets to the point where it moves and does something and provides that clarity, because otherwise it's just going to sit like an aircraft carrier. And I think that's the problem that we're seeing globally is you need something that puts up little guardrails so that people can innovate in financial services, which you can't have, or giant walls or nothing, because otherwise innovation will move abroad.
Thanks for that, Amanda. And, you know, I think in thinking about the different components of the US government, certainly we've got Congress and the need for new legislation as the aircraft carrier. That is just, you know, that has very clearly been the slow point in any legislative fixes that we've needed. We've had the administrative state and specifically the regulatory apparatus coming in, you know, a distant second for, I would say, second to last place for the slowest. You know, they are the part of government that is trying to see around corners, trying to engage with industry in the form of various consultation processes, notice and comment rulemaking. It takes a long time. And so I'm a little bit, you know, just my, you know, sort of pet issue. And I want to get to Sanjeev to talk about some of the robust enforcement activity that's happened that has been well noticed and on a fair notice basis. But, you know, this notion that it's exclusively regulation by enforcement, I don't buy it. So regulation is slow, but the enforcement that has been done has been based on some well-founded notice and comment rulemaking, a lot of it done by FinCEN as far back as 2019 that Amanda was referring to. And along those lines, Sanjeev, I want to turn to you to talk about a great summary article that you recently released discussing a lot of those cases. So the money services business, the need for licensing in various areas, prevention of money laundering, that is one of the more well-developed areas of US law. So if you come away with nothing today, please just remember, you know, that on your 330 panel or your 350 panel, you heard that it's not all regulation by enforcement, and that there are some very well-developed areas of the US regulatory body, which are then enforced by Sanjeev and his colleagues.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you again to my colleagues. Excellent. You can tell everyone is educated, opinionated, and we come from a variety of backgrounds. Specifically, Liz and Amanda are my colleagues, and we all came, I still am there, with the Department of Justice and our money laundering asset recovery section. The American Bar Association approached the DOJ, and they asked us this past summer, and actually this past year, to write an article discussing white collar crime, crypto enforcement involving anti-money laundering, regulation, the like involving digital asset economies. So myself and a couple of my great colleagues at the money laundering asset recovery section, we wrote an article. It's a public article, it's shareable, and if I haven't shared it with Sandra, I'm glad to. You can publish it on the GBBC's website or share it with your colleagues as appropriate. I guess we have to ask the ABA.
Send it to Wharton too.
I have to check with the American Bar Association first, to be clear, but it is public, and it's definitely been approved and blessed by our front office. We wanted to write the article for general practitioners, discussing and explaining some of the guardrails, anti-money laundering, what that looks like, know your customer, KYC, what does that look like, regulation, what does that look like? Because we've seen that in our legacy traditional financial systems. But what does it look like when applied to digital asset economies? So we wrote an article, a survey article that explains what is the Bank Secrecy Act? How does one register a money service business? To give you the guidance on the front end. And then to provide case study examples of enforcement where there's been prosecutions, when fraud happened, when corruption happened, when people have abused digital asset economies. Additionally, we dive into some of the risk involved with emerging technologies, being cognizant not to say that all DeFi is bad, because it's not. That would be incorrect. But there are challenges with chain hopping, with mixers, with tumblers, with abusing these technologies, such as using them to support nation state terrorism, similar to challenges we have with traditional finance, right? So what does this look like? And how can we educate each other as a society? That's why we're writing to general practitioners, because we need to educate each other as a society. And let's give you real life examples, published, documented examples, and explain to you, hopefully in understandable terms, and please feel free to come back and tell us if not, because with humility, we're still learning too. It's new, how this operates, how this works. And then finally to say, compliance, registration, regulation is important. It's important, just like it is in traditional finance, to protect digital asset economies, to protect the rule of law, to make sure we have a strong financial system, both in the US and abroad. And by doing this and by partnering with industry and encouraging others to register, to be compliant, to make sure you're educating your customer base of how the technology works, instead of just throwing out a contract that's not been audited and having it abused, have victims being your customers being affected, we can have more mainstream adoption. And the reality is we have seen this progress in traditional financial markets, in traditional financial systems over time. But now we're making progress, we're making efforts as a department, working with our sister components, with the SEC, with Treasury, I can't name everyone, there's too many to name, both domestically and abroad, to have progress in these areas. So these are things that the Department of Justice has done. These are things that we're going to continue to do, but we're doing it with a positive attitude, not to operate out of fear, but instead of saying there's hope. And if you see these challenges, let's root them out together. And I think we're going to come back to this if we have any time left on the role of the private sector. And we've been very public about, we have a partnership with the private sector, the government and the private sector working together. You are the first line of defense to root out and really observe challenges that arise in crime and fraud that you're seeing on your platforms. And being able to have a strong AML program and a strong KYC program will do a lot, not only to help advance, your own system and make sure that you're regulated and in compliance, but also for crypto writ large and digital asset economies. So that's a recent article that was published this summer. Another example of the great effort by our leadership to say, we're going to be in front of this. We're doing a lot in the department, and we're going to continue to work together, whole of government, domestic and abroad, to advance strong rule of law, but for the benefit of digital asset economies.
Excellent. Amanda, do you have something to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say, Sanjeev said something that was, I think for a lot of us that have done the transition from government to private sector and back again, one of the frustrations is that the industry's partnership, I'm not saying government's been great and perfect, but the industry partnership for the last decade, I think, could have been a lot better. And I think that's frustrating for some people, because now the entire house is on fire, and you have trade associations sometimes that are kind of arguing over the furniture, and you're like, this isn't really necessarily the most productive conversation. And I'm not saying that the trade associations aren't helpful, but the industry as a whole has been, let me say, the loudest voices of the industry were sometimes the least helpful, which was super difficult, right? Because for the first few years, and this is back when I was in government, the messaging, even as late as 2017, was don't regulate us at all. We shouldn't be regulated, don't regulate us, which then made it super problematic because there was no functional discussion of, well, if regulation is coming, what should that look like? And there still sometimes I feel like is a gap there. But I think one of the things when Sanjeev said, that public-private partnership, everybody wants that. I think, and I don't want to speak for people in the government, but I keep in touch with a lot of people in the government. And I think one of the frustrating things is what's felt like the lack of any kind of self-regulation from the industry. At this point, over a decade in, I'm not saying we necessarily should have had an SRO, it probably would be nice, but like the lack of any kind of like good actors calling out bad actors, like the sifting that should happen kind of in the industry to say, this is like, you know, what got us here won't get us there. And I think that's when you look at like a strong legal system, part of what has to happen is a discussion of the industry of what does the mature model of this look like and who's not there and who is there. And I think if we don't get to that point, even if we did have a government that, you know, didn't, I mean, everybody loves to think that, well, if Gary Gensler gets out, this whole problem is going to solve itself. No, like I think most of us are really cognizant that's not the case. It might help, but if there's nothing on the other side in terms of the industry being ready to have the adult conversation of what should, because you're going to be regulated. If there's nobody on the other side to have the adult conversation to make that public-private partnership a two-way street as opposed to a one-way street, I think a lot of us feel that's been part of the problem for too long, and we need to fix that.
Liz, I want to go back to your original question. And I want to thank Sanjeev and the Department of Justice for the work that you are doing, because I think in all these conversations, one of the common themes is leadership. And because we do not have regulatory clarity in the United States, we see regulation by enforcement. And when I look at the US and then I look at the rest of the world, I think it's a theme in many emerging technologies. So one of the other areas we're working on at Wharton is artificial intelligence. And I think that is another example where we don't have regulatory clarity yet. Maybe we will at some point, but the rest of the world is moving towards hopefully regulatory clarity, whether it's principles-based or it's more prescriptive. But without that, we are forced to adjudicate. And in adjudication, which is expensive and time-consuming, there's also the risk of lack of clarity. So in the US, we have 3 banking regulators, we have 2 markets regulators, we have policymakers, we have states as well. And I think without that leadership, this is the system that we are left with. But with leadership, business can better work together. I just want to return quickly to rule of law and the SDGs and what we're all talking about this week and next week, which is one of the fundamental concepts behind international law and rule of law is peremptory norms. And what's common between entities, what's common between us as people, what's common between us as countries, what was common between us as countries when we agreed to treaties in the UN. And that is one of the concepts behind rule of law. And I think it's fundamental to these cross-border financial issues that we're talking about. And I think going back to what Amanda said earlier, we have examples of success in international cooperation. And I'm sitting next to people on the stage who have been part of some of that success. So I would urge us to continue to move forward with that type of leadership, and we'll muddle through on some of it. But the other issue, I think, is technological expertise. And for that, having industry involved and engaged in the conversation and contributing to their own standard setting as well, I think is essential.
Great, thank you. And to end on a sort of note of hope, some of the elements that we have come up with today, talking about self-regulatory organizations, and I know it is very much part of the mission and thinking of GBBC and other organizations like the Crypto Market Integrity Coalition. This is a model that we've done in the United States. And, our Securities Exchange Commission, when it was set up in the 1930s, it didn't just do it all on its own. It relied on SROs like FINRA to be able to oversee various components of the market where those SROs had specific expertise, where they had relationships, the ability to license, regulate. So I strongly think and suggest everyone in this room kind of follow that as the tack, as we kind of, internationalize both the need for the rule of law and the strong legal system that we've got modeled in the US. If we count the states, we're looking much more at 55 different bank regulators in the United States. So if we can do it, at some point in the US with our dual banking system, we've already got a model for potential international cooperation there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have to wrap up.